There you go.
Thank you. So the last session here is on water conservation for mountain communities, and I will give you 3 examples on the kind of things we can do and the kind of issues which we have to be concerned about. So when you look at water supplies for drinking water and for human use, we can use rivers, we can use groundwater, we can use springs, we can use reservoirs, and we can also use roof water as options. And so the 4 steps you have to consider when you look for new water supplies is, first of all, you have to delineate the source of the water, be it a small catchment area or whatever. And once you have identified the source, you need to look at, are there any contaminants in the area which supplies the water? And then you have to determine how susceptible is your supply area and how vulnerable are they for climate change events like fires and landslides and all that kind of stuff. And then you prioritize the risk and you determine the capacity, and then you have your water source protected. So often what happens is when you have shortage of water, you try to enhance the storage by building more reservoirs or more capacity. That's usually quite expensive. And the second way which you can reduce your water consumption is by conservation. That's probably the most cost-effective short-term option. You can also look for new water sources, but this is becoming more and more difficult in those areas where you're water short. And you can start you can start thinking about reusing the water as grey water, and then you need to treat it. And that's possible, but it's, again, much more expensive. So those are the options you have if you are looking for water for domestic purposes. So I give you the first example in the Columbia Basin where we did all this. And it's a kind of an interesting case study because we got 14 communities we identified during the climate change educational program. We identified that people were really concerned about their drinking water supply. So we said in 2015, we said, how much water are these people actually using? And we found out they're using massive amounts of water because nothing was metered. Nobody worried about it in 2005. And now, because of climate change, all of a sudden this became a big issue. So the Columbia Basin Trust then said, we put up some money for any community who wants to participate in a 7-year program on how to reduce consumption in your community. So 20 communities participated in the program, and they pledged that they would reduce their water consumption by 20% between 2009 and 2015. Well, of these 20, only 14 actually produced comparable data which we could use to see what happened. And we used 12 climate stations in order to see what has happened in terms of climate change during this conservation effort. So here are the communities, the 14 communities which we used. And these are the kind of things you need to think about when we talk about domestic water in these mountain communities. You have to consider temperature and precipitation because your demand changes dramatically when you have no precipitation or high temperatures. You also have to consider the difference between the indoor water use and the outdoor water use and the commercial water use and the industrial water use if you have some small industries. You also have to start considering the behavior and the beliefs and the habits and the incentives and the regulations, because you can tell people that they should reduce their water consumption because we have shortages, and some of them don't believe there are shortages. There are even people who don't believe in climate change. So that's a behavioral issue you need to consider. Management also has to be considered because the capacity and the skill of maintaining your infrastructure is often quite difficult in mountains because, first of all, you often don't have a very good labor source who is very well educated in engineering, and also it's a high risk. And of course, the technology is an important thing because the infrastructure, the length of the infrastructure, the quality and the longevity of the infrastructure is important. So these are all the things you need to consider when we think about water conservation. You can do the technology part, but unless you have the people to believe that they should reduce consumption, it won't work. So here is typically what happens in small communities. This is community A. They use about 15% in terms of institutional, commercial, and industrial use in their village. So there is always some institutional thing for government agencies. There are commercial things like restaurants, and there are small industries. So in most communities, about 15% is what we call ICI, industrial, commercial, industrial, institutional, commercial, industrial. And then there is this non-revenue water. That is water which has they can't generate any revenues from that. This is for fighting fires and for something like community gardens and so on. And then, of course, a big part in many communities is how much leakage do you have? And remember, this is a big problem in the mountain communities because all the pipes often freeze and they break, and if you have a landslide, it's interrupted. So in some communities, it's very large. And then this is the actual residential water use. So in a community, you have to consider all of these. So one community might have this type of thing, and another community might have this type of thing. So every community has a different proportion of these 4 items. So we had 2005 to 2015 where we did this study. And here is the 100-year record. And in all of these communities, over the 7 years, we had the wettest and the hottest, all within a 7-year period. You see, these are the 100 years, which were all down here, and climate variability created all these new, incredibly unusual events at a time when we're trying to tell people they should start considering conserving their water use. So in terms here, we had so much water, it flooded everybody, so nobody cared about water. And here we had so little water because it was so hot that everybody was scrambling, all within the same 7 years. So if you plot up the temperature every month of the year versus the consumption, you can see that the winter time, all of these, this is month by month. There's very little difference in the amount of water people consume in the wintertime. However, as soon as you get into the summer, as the temperatures increase, your water consumption increases dramatically. Similarly, if you look at precipitation, in the period when you get low precipitation, your consumption goes up dramatically. When you have high precipitation, it is not so high. And this is just showing you the 2015, which previously you saw was this hot, very hot summer. So you can see it was very hot, and so very little precipitation, and of course very high water use. Excuse me. So if you look at 3 communities, this is the winter consumption and this is the summer consumption. Each community has a very different picture. So this community uses far more water in the summer in this community or that community. And if you look at, whoops, sorry. If you look at this community, you can see again, very different consumption rates depending on each community's habit. And then you get these, The red one is the traditional one, very little in the summer, in the winter, and very higher in the summer. But then you get this one, which has higher consumption in the winter and the same in the summer. So what is happening here? Well, this is a high mountain community, and they live at about 2,000 meters, and they're worried about all the freezing pipes. So what they do is they bleed the pipe every day. They let the pipes drip every 24 hours all along. That means the consumption in the winter time is actually higher than in the summer. So each community has different habits and different ways of dealing with this. So here is the example of these 14 communities. The blue is the 6 years, and the red is the 7th year, and the 7th year is what the hottest year. This is what at the end of the conservation effort. So you would expect that if a community did really well, they would have reduced their consumption, like the red part, and they would have even reduced their consumption during the driest part. So this community did a very good job. You see, that was the 4 or 5 years before, and then even during the driest part of the in 2015, they were able to reduce their winter consumption and to some extent their summer consumption. This community didn't do very well at all. It didn't change anything after 7 years of conservation. This community did reasonably well. This community did exceptionally well. You can see they not only decreased their consumption in 2014, but in 2015 even more. How do you explain this dramatic shift? Is that because everybody reduced their consumption? No. This is a situation where they had a major leak in their main supply system, and they fixed it. And once they fixed it, you can see how the consumption went down dramatically. So it's not just what people do, it's also when you repair things. And again, you can see some of these communities did reasonably well. This one did reasonably well in the summer, but not so much in the winter. And this one did not well at all. This is the high mountain community, which bleeds the pipes in the wintertime. So what you can do is, because the consumption is flat in the wintertime, but it increases in the summertime, you can actually do a regression. So at about 14-degree temperatures in this part of the mountain area, at about 14 degrees average monthly temperatures, their consumption increases, and each increases differently. So you can do a regression and predict how much more water is being used for every degree increase in temperatures during the summer. And if you do that, you get something like this. So in this community, for every degree increase in 14 degrees centigrades, they use 19 liters of more water per person per day. And some of these 50, and some of these much, much higher. So you can see every community has a different rate of summer use. And this depends entirely on how much gardening they do, how much, if they have a swimming pool or whatever they do in the mountains. The yellow is the communities which were not able to actually decrease their water consumption, and the one in gray were those communities who were able to reduce their consumption significantly over all these 7-year periods. So some were reasonably successful, some were not so successful. The other thing which was interesting is how much do they pay for the water? Nobody wants to pay for water. Everybody wants water for free. And remember, there is this human right issue, is water for human beings should be free. Well, you have to consider we need to clean the water, we need to protect the water. That is expensive, and so we need to actually charge some amounts. And there is this big debate in the UN about how much should we charge for water. And the idea came across that maybe what we should do is 25 liters per day is the absolute minimum for every person to survive. That should be free. And then as you use more and more, you progressively ask people to pay more money. This was actually initiated in South Africa, and they basically, I think they said 50 liter per person per day should be free, and the rest is progressively increased. So if you look at these communities, this is the amount they pay per year on a flat rate, $200 per year for the water they consume per person. And you can see it varies from community to community, depending on the infrastructure and how they treat the water and everything else. So the basic option for decreasing the water consumption is we need to meter everybody. In these mountain communities, none of the communities were metered. So when we initially did the study, they basically had no basic information and they had no metering. The second thing is we need to have volumetric charges so that people who use lots of water, they should actually pay more. And usually everybody uses what we call block rates. That means the low water users pay very little, the high water pays a lot more. You also have a toilet replacement program because toilets use massive amounts of water. In our part of the world, an old flush uses about 21 liters of water for every flush. And now think about this. A normal person goes 7 times a day flushing 21 liters. 7 times 21, that's a lot of, that's 150 liter or more water. So if you go to low flush systems, they can actually save you a huge amount of water because these low flush systems are 3 to 5 liters and work reasonably well. We also can have water saving devices. We can recycle and reuse gray water, because why do we use water treated to perfection with no pathogens to flush your toilet? I never understood this, so why not use gray water? And I'll show you this later on. The other problem, particularly in mountain communities, many of the communities in our part of the world, they were actually developed as mining towns. And though they put in the infrastructure at the turn of the century, and they never had very good plans on where the pipes are. They had no inventory how old the pipes are, and they had to fix leakages on a continuous basis without knowing how old the pipes are and when they should be replaced. The other thing you can do is you can actually lower the water pressure, because if you have high water pressure, people use far more water. And then in the summer, what you can do is you can do rainwater harvesting, and we'll go into that a little later. You can also improve the soil to hold more water, as I explained yesterday. If you do gardening, you can do much more efficient irrigation. Or if you don't like gardening and you have grass, you can do xeriscaping in planting only trees, grasses and shrub which are native and don't require water. And you can also let your lawn go yellow rather than green during the summer, because it comes back during the wet season. And you can also restrict the amount of water they can use for outdoor purposes, maybe 2 days a week or so. So if you look at the water consumption versus the cost of water, there's clear evidence that if you don't charge, people use lots of water, and if you do charge, use less water. That's a very obvious thing. So what did we accomplish by this survey of 7 years? We finally made every community to start thinking about accounting for water. It is a very complex task, but it is really important that people need metering, and obviously we need to calibrate these meters because they change every so often. So we are now at the point where we have new technology. We now have very smart meters, and these smart meters can actually determine remotely how much each house is using once it's installed. It is expensive initially, but it can save you huge amounts of water in the future. So water loss management is a big, big problem. And this is probably the greatest problem in the mountain communities because all these systems break. And I want to make clear how complicated it is to solve this water leakage problem. How do you actually determine where the leakage occurs? The best way to do this is between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. in the middle of the night when nobody uses water. And so you can put in a meter in a part of the subdivision of your community, and you look at how much water is being used or going through the system between 2 and 4 a.m. Well, think of this in the wintertime. When it is cold and it's 2 to 4 o'clock, the coldest and the most miserable time when you have to do this, that is a tough thing to do. You also need a very good inventory on and a replacement planning system for your pipes. You need equitable water pricing, which is difficult if you don't meter. You need a source water inventory and planning so you can predict the water. And you need a massive education program to tell the people that we have water problems and we need to reduce the water consumption. And then for food security, if people want to grow more food locally in their gardens and so on, we need to use much more efficient irrigation. So only 2 communities were able to actually meet their 20% consumption reduction, and all communities achieved some reduction at certain times. Leakages was the greatest problem. Hot and dry summers created all new challenges for these communities because very few were prepared for these extreme events, and some successfully addressed the demand for initiating summer water restrictions. So this was a big learning experience, and I think now we're at the point where it takes about 5 to 7 years before the community is actually aware of what we need to do as the climate is changing. So here is another example of how this climate change is affecting our drinking water. This is the water supply for a small community where I live, very close to. So this is the reservoir. It supplies water for 25,000 people. It is located in the mountains right here. And you can see in the wintertime, we get lots of snow. And in the summertime, we get little snow in the bars. And the reservoir capacity is like this. So what has happened in 2012? In July, there was still snow in the mountains. And the reservoir was full. Everybody was happy. Middle of summer, no problem. By September, all the snow was gone, and the reservoir was at this point, and it didn't rain for the rest of September, and by October, the reservoir was like this. So they were even at the point where they were going to try to fly in by helicopter some pumps to pump the last part of the reservoir into the system. Why did this happen? This is the mean precipitation in millimeters per month in blue. This is what happens on an average. And in 2012, this is what happens. We still had lots of precipitation in June. In July, it was lower. In August and September, we had virtually nothing. And this created this stress situation. So this was a wake-up call, and everybody thought, oh, well, this is just an unusual year. why worry about it? 2016, 4 years later, we had a very similar situation, but different from the one before. You can see we had reasonable precipitation until April, and then in May and June and July, we had below average precipitation. And fortunately, in August, we got some precipitation, so that saved them, because here they already went under restrictions, and that saved them for that year. So these fluctuations will happen more and more and more, which means this is the average in blue, this is what happened in 15, this is what happened in 16. You can see how this is going to affect our water supply system. So when you look at what this happens here, this is a snow-fed supply. So if you look at the average temperatures over time, this is what's happened to the summer temperatures, and this is what happens to the winter temperatures. And you can see both of them are increasing. It's bad for snow. If you look at the summer precipitation is declining, the winter precipitation is declining, and the snow cover is declining, which means this is in very precarious conditions because of climate change. And that means we have a number of options. We can look for other sources. We can increase the reservoir. We can do conservation measures. But in all cases, there is no easy solution. We need to look at all these different things, and we also need to look at reusing greywater. So my Nepali colleague who is participating was asking me about the women in Nepal collect all the water, and she was concerned about how do we alleviate the problem of shortages of water in a Himalayan community. So we worked on these watersheds for a long time. We had two watersheds. One was the Yarsa up near Jiri and the Chiku near Dulikhel. And we did some GIS analysis and looked at what is the land use and where are all these water supplies. Now remember, in the Himalayas, you get the dry season when you get this type of water, and you get the wet season when you have so much water you don't know what to do with it. And this is obviously a critical situation when you have 4 months of massive water and the rest of the year very little. So I learned, I'm not a social scientist, so I learned we had an economist and a social scientist working with us, and they taught us how to do such surveys. So the survey we did was we used a team of a male and a female, and these two people would go to all the little individual residents, and ask questions, general questions about water, household water use and animal water use, agricultural water use, and their perception of what the water issues are and what the problems are. And the idea was the female interviewer would only interview the female resident, and the male only the male resident, because we wanted to find out, are there different perceptions between the male and female? This was a fascinating thing to me, because one of the questions, the general questions which they ask the female, if you would have an extra $50, what would you use that dollar for? And the female residents would say, well, the first priority I would buy gold jewelry. And we were totally flabbergasted when they said, well, if you're in a poor environment and you have some extra money, why would you buy gold jewelry? We asked the male, and the male said, if we would have an extra $50, we would buy a female water buffalo. The female water buffalo produces milk. We can sell that. We make money. So we couldn't understand this. So we went back to both of them and said, why do you have completely different priorities? The women said to us, why would we want to buy a female water buffalo? We have to get the feed, we have to get the water, we have to look after the animals, we have them every day bringing out to the river so they can actually drink. We have enough work, we don't want any more animals because our workload is far too high. So why would he then buy gold, jewelry? They said, well, if somebody gets sick, this is the only security we have. So by doing these kind of surveys, you get completely different information. And this is very, very important. And the reason why we did it with the female, because the female are the people who look after the water use in Nepal. The men only use water for irrigation. That's where they dominate, but all for the rest, for household use, for animal, for everything, the women are responsible. So it's really problematic. So in this one watershed, the upper watershed, these are all the water sources for all the communities in this watershed. So about 215 different sources. And some of these sources are kuvas, springs, stone spouts, taps, streams, all vary. So here's an example of the other watershed where we show you what type of water supplies do they use. Some use a local source of a river. Some have these kind of springs. Some have different springs. Some have collection systems, and so on and so on. So each source is very different. So then we put all of this information from the survey onto the GIS. And so the first question was, what are your concerns about drinking water quality? Blue means no, we have no problems, and red say we have significant problems. Here is the irrigation water. Here in red, these are all the sources or the communities which have problems with irrigation water, and here is where they have troubles with water quantity. So you can see the problems are different in different areas for different things, for quantity, quality, and irrigation. So then we ask them, if we would have extra water, what is your priority? What is the most important water use you want to consider? And of course, the women all told us drinking water and cooking is the most important one. Animal watering is the second, washing and cleaning the third, and irrigation, particularly for the women, is not as important. So we could actually go and look at the daily water collection time for the different villages. So these are all the different villages in this watershed. And this is the time they need to collect the water from their systems every day. So the very light green ones is 5 minutes. The dark middle green is 5 to 10 minutes. The dark green is 10 to 20 minutes. And the red are more than 30 minutes to 120 minutes carrying water. And so if you look at this, these are the communities. This is the minimum, the maximum, and the mean. You can see the average is about 40 minutes or something. Well, 26 minutes is the average. So every day, the women go out and spend half an hour roughly, typically to collect water, and under very different conditions during the monsoon situation. And then we started to look at how much water do they actually carry. So the average per capita per water per day is about 23 liters. That's 23 kilograms. That's the average. Look at the consumption per household, which the women have to collect for these different villages. Huge. And I'd be very humble because I watched some of these women carry 50 liters of water for 20 minutes. I could not do it in these mountain environments. It is incredible what they actually do. So the idea behind this was, how could we reduce the workload for these women so that they don't have to spend that much time and so much effort to collect the water every day? In addition, not only do they have to collect the water for the housing operation, but they also have to collect the water for the animals, because they have very little grazing land in these watersheds, so they can often bring them down to the river during the monsoon season, but they can't do it during the dry season because often there is no water in the stream. So this is giving you the number of times per minute they spend in terms of collecting water for animals. And also, and now for the irrigation part, the river system, they built massive amounts from the headwaters to the mound, massive amounts of dams, little dams, to store the water for irrigation. And obviously that is also very time consuming. So we started thinking about, can we do water harvesting? Because in the monsoon season, you get 80% of the water and the rest of the year you have nothing. So we built these underground cisterns. I learned this from our experience in Egypt, where they have been doing this for many, many years, where you make a catchment area and you collect the runoff. You make a big detention system for the sediment to settle, and then the outlet goes into the system. So you can actually collect water in the monsoon season and then use it in the dry season when you don't have very much water. But you cannot build very large systems because farmers have small amounts of land. So you can only collect a small amount of water, something like 30,000 liters per tank. That is not a lot of water to irrigate agricultural crops. So in order to use this water efficiently, you can go to what we call drip irrigation systems. And we're now at the point where these drip irrigation systems are very, very cheap. It costs you about $20 for half a hectare of land to be irrigated by drip system. And I had a graduate student who did their thesis on this in Nepal, and she actually is the only graduate student in my career who actually paid for her research, because she grew cauliflower with drip irrigation during the dry season, which she could market, and made enough money to pay for all the infrastructure. So here's our experiment, and these are the drip system, the storage system. All you have to do is every second day fill this and then do that. But we made a big, big mistake. Why did we make a big mistake? We built these underground cisterns in an earthquake-prone environment. So you build this wonderful system, and then you have an earthquake and it cracks and you lose it. And so this was a hard lesson to learn. And now what we're doing is we're saying, why don't you build a little pond, cover it with plastic, and that might be a far better solution. You do have to cover it with plastic, otherwise you will lose most of it by evapotranspiration. You can also do this for drinking water. And so we looked at building these local systems where you can actually collect the water from the roof and then use this in local environments. So we did trials with about 13 different systems and at low costs, some of it in plastic, some of it with local materials, and that will help you in order to collect drinking water. So what we learned in this kind of a situation is, yes, we can do quite a lot by improving not only the conservation, the reduction by conservation, but also by using the rainwater in a harvesting system, which could be expanded at a local level quite effectively. In fact, I even do this in my part of the world. I have 2 rain barrels, and I will collect my roof for my outdoor purposes, and I don't use any domestic water for my gardening. So I would encourage you to look at this quite extensively, and it is a very good thing to do even in an urban environment. But as I mentioned to you, you have to be very careful about the roof material and cleaning the roof on a regular basis and having a system where you reduce the first flush and to have some measures of dealing with bacteria and pathogens. We now have very good engineered system. In Australia, about 2 million people rely on their drinking water from roof water harvesting. And this is something which can happen even in a very poor developing world. And as a first case, collect your roof water for outdoor purposes. Then you don't need to treat it at all. So hopefully that gives you some ideas how we can reduce this. So in terms of water conservation, we should meter if we can. We should price it at a volumetric use basis. We should have all these low flush systems. We should restrict outwater uses during dry seasons. We can do rainwater harvesting. We can improve the soils that the soils can hold more water, and we can use for gardening and flowering, use flowers which don't use a lot of water. And for source protection, we need to control the source. In other words, the land use within the area which supplies you water has to be restricted. And you need buffer zones around your streams. You need wetlands to help you with storage. You need beneficial management practices and different kind of protection for groundwater. We tried to look at groundwater sources in Nepal, but again, that was very, very difficult because it is very expensive to drill deep wells in the mountain environment where you have to bring in all these big trucks, and building shallow wells is very dangerous because of the very intensive agriculture, because they all get polluted by excess nutrients. Now, another very important thing is we got lots of mountain lakes, and some of the mountain lakes are used for drinking water, some are just for nature, and we need also a multi-barrier approach to protect these lakes in the mountains. And often what happens in the mountains, the lakes are changing very, very rapidly, not because we are doing anything to them, but because of climate change. So I want to go through very quickly on the kind of issues which we're facing in lakes in mountain communities, which are unaffected by land use. That means all virgin and wonderful lakes in high distances from all urban activities. So we have to deal with nutrients. If you do agriculture, you create all problems with manure, fertilizer, nitrate, phosphate. Phosphate is the biggest problem for eutrophication. We also have the animals grazing and going through the river, and obviously they create all kinds of problems, not only with water quality, but also with pathogens. And then, of course, we have the sediment problems. That creates all kinds of problems with filtering systems. We got some metal problems in many areas, and I'll show you this. This is not necessarily metals from industrial purposes in mountains, but these are metals from the geological formation. And of course, we have to deal with hydrocarbons when you have fires and air pollution and all that. All of this influences the water quality. So this is just showing you that many of the geological formations actually can create all kinds of different problems for water quality. If you have granitic bedrock and some volcanic fissures, and you drill a well for groundwater, and you intercept one of these fissures, you're going to have all kinds of problems with arsenic and other kind of metals. If you are in a granitic environment, that water is very soft. It virtually has very, very little cations in it. If you're in a limestone environment, they have a huge amount of cations in it, and it's a very hard water. So the granitic water is very soft. If you put soap in it, it lathers up very quickly. If you're in a limestone environment, it's very hard water and it doesn't soap up very well. So remember, the rocks create all kinds of differences. This is limestone, this is shale and sandstone, this is granite and volcanic material, and each one create different kind of water quality conditions. Here's a good example of the Yukon in northern Canada where I work. Here is shale material which contains pyrite. Pyrite is an iron sulfide, and it's perfectly stable if there is no oxygen. But as soon as you have oxygen, it oxidizes and creates sulfuric acid. Look at this kind of natural occurring water pollution. And then the other area around here is limestone. So when this acid water, which contains all kinds of metals, comes into the very hard water, you create a complete laboratory of pollution, which is fascinating to see. And if you want to find out where this is happening, as soon as you get pyrite to oxidize, it becomes very acidic. So you can actually go and look at all these tributaries with a pH meter, and you can find out where it is acidic, and that is the source of the problem. We did this in Nepal in some areas where we actually went with a pH meter, portable pH meter, looked at about 100 different tributaries to find out where some of these problems could occur. So how do we protect mountain lakes? Lakes are usually oligotrophic. That means they have very low nutrient content, depending on the geology. If it's granitic, it's super low nutrient. And that means you don't have a lot of organisms, so you have high biodiversity in the aquatic organisms. But you've got very many different algae and invertebrates which can live under these low nutrient conditions. So these lakes are incredibly highly sensitive to nutrient inputs. If you now change the nutrient input, this changes the whole ecology of these remote mountain lakes. So what is happening because of climate change, we got a rapid increase in the temperatures of these lakes. We got airborne deposition of dust and rain and pollutants from long distances, including organic matter from fire and long-distance transport. And we also got differences from glacial retreat. In fact, as an example, a week ago in our city, we all had terrible air pollution problems from the fires in our neighboring province of Washington State. And because they had these massive fires and the wind were blowing, all this soot was coming into the city. You couldn't even see the mountains from my window. And it created all kinds of contaminants going into water supply. So why are these mountain lakes temperatures increasing so rapidly? In a mountain lake, temperature increases about 0.3 degrees per decade. The air temperatures are increasing less fast, and the ocean temperatures even less fast. So the mountain temperatures of the are increasing faster than anywhere else. Why is this happening? What's the reason for these increases? Well, first of all, we have a little more less clouds. That means we got more radiation. We have much ice cover. If you now look at the ice is melting earlier, and the ice is a perfect reflection surface for the energy which comes in. So if the ice melts earlier, the energy goes right into the lake, and the lakes are warming up faster. And with higher temperatures, we get more evaporation, so shallower lakes are much more susceptible to temperature changes. And the impact on lake warming is, first of all, once it gets warmer, it holds less oxygen, it decreases the algal growth, and you've got all kinds of chemical concentrations which are changing because you have less water, less dilution, and more evaporation. It changes the whole food ecosystem, increases the changes the primary production, and changes the species composition. So these lakes are changing much faster than people have actually known, and many of these are affected by controls which we cannot control, like airborne dust and airborne nutrient deposition, and even airborne contaminants. We have no longer used DDT in our part of the world, but in some of our Arctic lakes and high mountain lakes, we actually detected DDT in the last 5 years, because it's still being used in some of the developing countries, and with the airborne transport, it's actually affecting these lakes. So mountain communities are mountain lakes are incredibly sensitive to inputs of nutrients. What I'm showing you here is a high mountain lake in Kunming, China. When we started our project in that part of the world, it was a beautiful mountain lake with no eutrophication, and it was used extensively for tourism. Within the 7 years of our project in that country, the whole lake became completely eutrophic, as you can see here in the picture, mainly because all the agricultural activity and all the urban development around the mountain lake got into the lake, and within 7 years, it went from a pristine to a eutrophic system. And the biggest problem for eutrophication is it can happen very fast. To reverse the process takes decades, because not only do you have to reduce the input, but you also have to remove what is already in the system, and most of the accommodation of the phosphorus is in the sediment which is in the lake bottom, and that sediment releases that phosphorus very, very slowly over time. So even if you stop everything coming in, you still have that thing, and it takes decades for it to rehabilitate. So the options we have for all these problems is to reduce air pollution globally, which is difficult, but we need to start doing that. We need to enhance wetlands in the headwaters, because if we could put a wetland before the inflow of the lake, that will supply you with water on a regular basis and filter everything. And we need to consider we might have to lime some of these lakes. And rather than liming it with airplanes and so on, probably the best thing to do is take some limestone pebbles and put it into the lake or into the river, because then very, very slowly some of that carbonate will be dissolved, and this will help assist in the acid pollution problem. So it's time for me to say goodbye. Arrivederci, Danyabat. Have a great course. Thank you for all your wonderful Italian friends for their support. And I would like to draw your attention to this website. I teach a course in water in international development, and I've been teaching that for 20 years. And in my last year of my career, I decided to make an app. And so this is a textbook on the app, and I try to update it almost every year, and it's openly available. So if you're interested in some of these ideas about international development, this is not only for mountains, it's for all kinds of water-related issues. So it's basically a textbook which you can easily look at and use it as you wish. And here are some of the examples which we experienced. And I remember we had the last beer in the Atacama Desert at 5,000 meters after a 4-week trip of no water. So thank you very much, and I will be happy to answer a few questions for you.
Thank you very much, Hans. Thank you really, really much. So there are 2 questions. One from Lupa that said that there is a growing need for water for domestic use worldwide, yet more water is being used for agricultural production, especially sugar. Striking a balance between domestic needs and commercial ones would be a center of unrest in the near future and around the countries, taking Ethiopia and Egypt as a case for this time.
Correct. You're smart. You probably know all of the stuff I told you, and I bored you for the last 2 days.
I don't think so, but okay. And then there is a comment from Gita that she said that too much and too little water is the major problem. We are flooded with too much water and also face drought.
Yes. And again, we have not many options to actually deal with too much and too little.
Yeah.
But for too little, we need to really work on water harvesting. This is not only for small-scale harvest watering. We can do this at an intermediate scale as well. Look at the Italians. They build reservoirs for snowmaking. That's water harvesting. We can do this for domestic purposes.
Okay, another question from Sonigitu. How do we leverage on the impact of Cruder pollution in the Niger Delta Creek as it affects the aquatic ecosystem? Please advise.
Wow. Well, first and foremost, we need to reduce our carbon footprint. We need to reduce the air pollution we generate, because unless we don't do that, climate change will be the biggest issue we are facing. And I put a lot of faith in you people, because you are now at the beginning and in the middle of your career. And you're all very highly educated. So use as much of your innovative ideas to correct all the problems which we created. And hopefully this will help the whole process of mountain conservation.
Okay, so from Lupa, how best can mountain waters and critical resources be reintegrated into livelihood framework in a country like Uganda?
I don't have all the answers. All I have is some small suggestions on what individuals can do, and hopefully with better education and with better communication, we can actually try to take these individual efforts and organize it so that more people have access to it and more people will do it. I'm a true believer that the action has to start at the local level, and you have to kind of show your success stories and communicate those properly so that all the other people will take part of it.
Okay, from Beatrice. So we could use the organism in mountain lakes as bioindicator. They are so sensitive.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the organisms are the best policemen to show environmental change. The invertebrates live in the same environment. They don't move very far in the river system. So the invertebrates sit there for a long time. They get affected by all the different pollution and water quantity problems. And so there are very good long-term indicators on how the invertebrate population changes as a result of pollution and climate change. So we now have communities trained to do invertebrate analysis. They do the classic every 5 years, they go in the same river basin, in the river spot. They collect the sample, they identify the things, and then they send it to the expert to do the best information. And this is a good way of long-term monitoring. And it's not expensive, and the people love it because the kids love to see these organisms. So it's a very good way of long-term monitoring. And those who are hiking in the high mountains, they're environmentally conscious. That's a very good way for citizen activity.
Okay, thank you very much, Hans. Now I'm opening all the microphones because you deserve a really, really big applause. Thank you very much, Hans. So the group, see you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. and home time. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow. Thank you, Hans.
I didn't get a chance. Thanks a lot. Hey.
See you soon.
मैंने इतना पुश कर दिया
यदि हेयर क्लिप में से क्लिप के निकला तो थोड़ा चलेगा
ठीक है इसके सांप आया
नहीं इसके बाद